Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Baxley with another lecture for the Como-Pickton U.S. History 1302 class and the honors class. We are going to be talking today about the Civil Rights Movement. Specifically, we're talking about the African American Civil Rights Movement. There are a lot of civil rights movements in American history. In fact, you could talk about the civil rights movement of the Latin American Civil Rights Movement, the Native American Civil Rights Movement, all kinds of different movements where people are fighting to gain access to equal rights in society. In this specific case, though, most of the time in America, when you say the civil rights movement, people are thinking about the African American civil rights movement. To be even more specific, though, we are talking about the African American civil rights movement that is from approximately 1954 to about 1968. And that period of time where we see a lot of growth of African American rights and equality under the law in the United States. Technically, there's been a lot of African American civil rights movements, even in the United States, but this is the one we're focusing on. So let's get some context. From 1896 to 1954, there was a legal system throughout the United States called separate but equal. If you recall, before the Civil War, most African Americans in the United States were slaves. After the Civil War, the slaves were emancipated and freed, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment provided equal protection of the laws to all citizens of the United States and said that former slaves were citizens. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed African Americans' right to vote, as long as they were men. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. But in the United States, those rights of African Americans were almost immediately trampled upon by Southern governments after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. As we've discussed before, Southern former Confederate groups worked immediately to take back control over their state governments and suppress African American rights, creating systems of laws called Jim Crow laws, which discriminated against African Americans and reestablished white dominance in the southern United States after the Civil War and Reconstruction. These laws did all sorts of things, from separating where African Americans could live, where they could work, where they could go in public places, to also being supplemented by things that prevented African Americans from voting, like literacy tests, which are tests you had to take to be able to vote, and poll taxes, which were taxes that people had to pay in order to vote. These laws were discriminatory, and because they treated one group of people differently than another, they violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects the rights of all citizens equally. However, whenever these laws were challenged in the court system, the Southern lawyers and the Supreme Court that was favorable to those Southern lawyers thought things differently. This was established in a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1896 is when the Supreme Court case comes out. Homer Plessy was an African-American man who was actually partially African-American. In fact, if you look at a picture of him, here he is right here. This is Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was African-American, and the way that the laws worked, even if you were 1/8 African-American in places like Louisiana, for example, he was subject to all the discriminatory laws that affected African Americans. And Homer Plessy was about 1/8 African American, and he decided to go on a train and purchased a first-class ticket. He purchased a first-class ticket to a train and sat in the first-class section of the train. But because he was African American, he was told to get off that first-class section of the train. He refuses. It goes back and forth. Before the thing is settled, it goes to court. And it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Homer Plessy makes the argument that because of the 14th Amendment, he has equal protection under the laws, and he has equal right to a first-class ticket. If he bought it, he deserves to sit in first class. The Supreme Court disagreed, and they said the train is going to the same place. It's an equal trip, whether you're in the front of the train or the back of the train. So the Supreme Court said it was okay to separate black and white people in society as long as the facilities were equal. And this separate but equal doctrine was taken by Southerners, and they ran with it, and they forgot about the equal part, and they just kept the separate part, and they created literally two societies in the Southern United States, one black and one white. This was supplemented by, there was legal segregation, and then there was more informal efforts to promote segregation, like things like the Ku Klux Klan, hate groups, intimidation, and violence, which together with the laws of segregation worked to make sure that African Americans were under an oppressive government and under an oppressive society and dominated by white people throughout much of American history. However, African Americans didn't just sit and take this. They didn't just accept this as their lot in life. African Americans desired their freedom, and they desired their equality of rights, and they deserved equality of rights, and they deserved to have equal access to society, and they deserved to have equal protection of the laws. This system of segregation was wrong, and it hurt millions and millions of people and caused a lot of suffering, a lot of death, and a lot of problems. Here is a map. The yellow states had segregation by law. Purple states had local options. That meant that some cities had segregation, some cities did not. The red had no legislation about it. And the green states had segregation prohibited by law. But don't think that these northern states are innocent. Segregation happened all across the United States, and racism happened all across the United States. And segregation in places like New York and Chicago were not formally under the law, but rather informally. Technically, African Americans could buy a home wherever they wanted to in New York City, but no one would sell to them. A lot of informal efforts were done to prevent African Americans from accessing society and accessing their rights and their economic opportunities that white Americans could. Now, things started to change early on in the progressive era. From 1900 to 1920, we see a group of African Americans start pushing to change things. We've talked about Booker T. Washington before. He was an African American reformer who wanted African Americans to exercise their economic rights, to get away from sharecropping and being renters and being under the economic control of whites, and be their own independent businessmen, own independent farmers, and to have economic security, and then they would have political security afterwards. W.E.B. Du Bois, he focused on political rights and civil rights, and he wanted African Americans to push for equal rights in politics first to protect everything that they held dear. W.E.B. Du Bois founded something called the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This was an organization dedicated to advancing the rights and the political situation of African Americans in the United States. And they were very successful in creating a group of very talented, intelligent African American lawyers who were ready to fight for the legal rights of African Americans. And the NAACP legal team later on wins the Supreme Court cases that overturn much of segregation. World War II sees a change in the United States' attitude about segregation as African Americans serve in the military, and they prove to the world their ability to serve their country. They overturn a lot of biases and prejudices against African Americans that said that they were not able to fight, that they weren't as good as white people and stuff like that. And all that crap gets overturned when African Americans serve with distinction, even when they're fighting in segregated units. The Tuskegee Airmen is a group of very effective African American fighter pilots, and they're put in a movie called The Red Tails, or just Red Tails. This man over here on the right is Dory Miller. He won the Medal of Honor in the Battle of Pearl Harbor. He was just a cook. He wasn't even supposed to be a fighter for the Navy. But whenever the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he manned a gun that had been abandoned, and he defended his ship, and he went above and beyond the call of duty and won the Medal of Honor. And there are countless more African Americans who served with distinction in World War II. And when they came home after World War II and they had been soldiers, they did not want to just go back to being second-class citizens in the United States. In the 1940s, we start to see some changes in race relations. After World War II, the United States is in the middle of the Cold War. We want to be the leader of the free world. We want to be the leader of democracies. But how are we supposed to tell people that you need to be a democracy, you need to be like us, when we treat African Americans like crap in our own country? This is hypocrisy. How are we supposed to preach, freedom and justice and equality and democracy when we can't give that to our own people in America? So President Truman takes the lead in 1949, and he orders the end of segregation in the U.S. military. We also have celebrities like Jackie Robinson, the first African-American Major League Baseball player, who is, put in the movie 42, and he proved to the world that African-Americans could be successful on a national stage, and he changed a lot of people's hearts and minds. However, the real fight begins in the 1950s. That National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had put together a team of really good, experienced lawyers who understood how they were going to attack segregation. They began suing public schools all across the South. The school system is one of the worst examples of segregation. Okay? The segregated school systems across the United States were not in any way equal. Okay, they were offering students dramatically different quality of education, and this perpetuated African-American poverty. Okay, education is the great equalizer. Okay, you can start out without much in life and get a good education and end your life in a higher social standing. But if you don't get a good education, it's hard to get out of poverty. And because African Americans were being neglected in their education and more educational resources were being given to white students, this perpetuated a gap in income and a gap in skills and a gap of education that led to worse and worse problems for African Americans. States would normally spend about 10 to 20 times as much on white students than they would on African American students. So the NAACP starts suing these public schools, and they're led by a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. Later on, Thurgood Marshall becomes the first African American Supreme Court justice. But as a young man, he was a lawyer fighting for the rights of African American students. He argued that the separate school system was causing unconstitutional damage to young African Americans. And so, nearly 50 years after the Supreme Court said back in 1896 that separate but equal was okay, in 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the case of Brown v. Board of Education that separate facilities are inherently unequal. The schools were then ordered to integrate racially with all deliberate speed. So all across the country, all the schools are ordered to integrate with all deliberate speed. Now, what on earth does that mean? With all deliberate speed. Does that mean tomorrow? Does that mean in a year? Does that mean in 10 years? Does that mean in 20 years? It doesn't put a deadline. Imagine if I gave you a homework assignment and I said, just turn it in with all deliberate speed. When would I get that homework assignment back? Never. You would never give it back. You would deliberate and deliberate and deliberate, and you'd never have any speed. I know I would do the same thing. And so it's certainly true that Southern states who did not want to integrate just blew this order off. So the battle changes to getting individual schools to start to change and getting things to change in other parts of the law. Here is an example of an African-American classroom and a white classroom, okay? The difference in funds, the difference in materials, it's striking. Okay? You have one teacher teaching dozens and dozens of students of different ages, of different, abilities, levels. Imagine teaching, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, all the way up to high school at the same time in one big room. Whereas the white classroom, you have all the students the same age. They all have these nice desks. They have this nice big white blackboard. They've got, windows. It's a lot different. And this can tell you, are they going to get the same education? This teacher can try all she wants, but I'll tell you, it's hard managing just 15 students in one classroom. I cannot imagine doing this. That would be so difficult. But this was the struggle that many African Americans dealt with before schools were integrated. Now, Southern states are not happy about Brown versus Board of Education. It kicks off a wave of civil rights protests, but it also kicks off a wave of anti-civil rights protests. And there's a backlash or massive resistance against the Brown versus Board of Education order. Technically, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation, but there's two different forms of segregation we need to talk about. This is some Latin for you. De jure means of the law, that's on paper. De facto means in reality. So the Supreme Court can write on paper, segregation is no more, but that doesn't translate to reality. You have to go out on the ground and change it in the de facto world. 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, fewer than 10% of the Southern public schools had integrated. The Brown decision only affected schools as well. So in all other ways, segregation was still the law of the land for the 1950s and much of the 1960s. And for that to change, it would require more protest. So African Americans all across the South are tired of segregation, and they need just one spark to get things going. And that spark comes from a woman named Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. The rules in the Montgomery bus system was that African Americans were supposed to sit in the back, whites would sit in the front, but if the bus started to fill up, a white person could go to an African American, tell them to stand up, and take their seat. When a white man ordered Rosa Parks to stand up, she refused to do so. She ends up getting arrested. In this moment is very important. She defied the law. You see, for segregation to work, African Americans had to comply, okay? African Americans had to be afraid of the consequences of segregation and be afraid to get lynched or to get thrown in jail or to get beaten up. And Rosa Parks not being afraid to sit down, that took a lot of courage. And even though she was thrown in jail, she had already won because she refused to obey. She refused to obey a law that was unjust. And this idea of refusing to obey a bad law captures the attention of a young Baptist minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, whose name was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the leader of the African American Civil Rights Movement. And we need to talk about him a little bit, okay? Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher, and he had studied a lot of different people's writings. He had studied the writings of Henry David Thoreau, who was he was a civil disobedient person. He studied Mohandas Gandhi, who had peacefully protested the British occupation of India, and their teachings of nonviolence and civil disobedience as a way to resist injustice deeply influenced Martin Luther King Jr. More importantly, Martin Luther King Jr. was a devout Christian. He was a Baptist preacher. And so he looked to the example of Jesus Christ as an example for his life, particularly the message in the book of Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 and 39. Okay, in that passage, Jesus says this, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." This idea of not resisting evil with evil, but resisting evil with good was something that defined Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. Any person can punch back. It doesn't take a lot of strength. It doesn't take a lot of courage to have someone hit you and then you hit them back. In fact, any wild animal can bite someone that hits them. But it takes a strong person to take a hit and not hit back. If someone does something evil to you and you do something evil back, you just made two evils. But if someone does something evil to you and you do something good, you're the better person. You've done what's right, and that evil can be overcome. So Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea was to overcome evil with good, to not sink to the level of the white supremacists who would use violence and intimidation and evil to get what they wanted, but rather he would use good, he would use kindness, and he would disobey bad laws but he was not going to do it violently. He said if there was a law that was unjust, it would be wrong to obey it. If there's a law that tells you to do something evil, then you need to do what is good and break the law. That's Martin Luther King's philosophy. So Martin Luther King Jr., in the face of the injustice of the Montgomery bus system, organized a boycott. A boycott is when you refuse to buy something. And so African Americans across the city of Montgomery, Alabama, refused to ride the bus. And this is a big deal. They're not being violent, but they are exercising their strength. They're not going to obey the white power structure, and they're going to do it in a way that's nonviolent. And so look at this from the outside perspective. Who are you going to side with? If you're an outsider and you have no stake in this, you see the people of Montgomery, Alabama, and how cruel they are to African Americans. And African Americans, their way of fighting back is just not riding the bus. It's clear who's the good guy. The African Americans are doing what's right. And it's clear who's messed up, and that's the bus system. Black people and all those who disagreed with segregated bus systems started refusing to ride the bus on December 5th, 1955, and they vowed to do this until the system was desegregated. This terrified the people of Montgomery, Alabama, because again, segregation will not work unless African Americans agree to follow the rules, okay? They need to use fear to get a few of them to obey, and then hopefully the rest will obey. But if all of them refuse to obey, then the system falls apart. African Americans realize this, and they get the system to fall apart. Montgomery government and the whites in Montgomery tried to sabotage the boycott. They arrested Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders. They would subject the boycotters to violence. 4 African American churches are bombed during this boycott. And even Martin Luther King Jr.'s family home was bombed. If he had been in a different room of the house, him and his family could have all died right then. But the boycott continues. The African Americans stay strong and they stay in solidarity, and 99% of them refuse to ride the bus, and the bus company is losing money. If they don't give up, they're going to go out of business. On November 23rd, 1956, the Supreme Court gets involved, and they find the segregated busing system unconstitutional, and the bus system is desegregated. African Americans win this battle. And this battle, which is fought non-violently, provides a blueprint for further protests. And more protests follow this one that follow the same blueprint. African Americans disobey an unjust law, and they get things to change. It inspires African Americans all across the South to stand up to injustice, starting a national civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to fight segregation. And we see African Americans work together to help each other get to work, to protest together, and this solidarity overcomes the segregated system in Montgomery. The most high-profile showdown in the segregation and the battles against segregation happens in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Supreme Court had ordered schools to desegregate, and on September 3rd, 1957, 9 African-American students attempt to desegregate the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is the capital of Arkansas, and the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, he gets angry at the courts ordering the schools to desegregate, so he orders the Arkansas National Guard to literally prevent children from going to school. So there are soldiers around the school that turn away the African Americans. And those soldiers are surrounded by giant crowds of angry white citizens who surround the school, and they intimidate and they threaten the African Americans and they run them off. This happens on television. People all across the country watch this, and a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines saying, this is messed up, especially President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower was reluctant to get involved in the civil rights movement. He considered himself to be a moderate, and so he did not want to get involved. But when a state openly defies the federal government ordering them to desegregate and uses the military, even though it's the Arkansas National Guard, it's the U.S. military, that is like the setup for a civil war, a state fighting against the federal government. So Eisenhower sends in the 101st Airborne. This isn't some piddly little Arkansas National Guard. The 101st Airborne, those are the people that, not the same soldiers, but that unit, they parachuted into D-Day the day before D-Day happened, okay? These guys are bad dudes, okay? And they show up, and the crowds, they get taken care of. And for the rest of the year, the 101st Airborne escort students to school. They escort them to class. They watch them in the hallways. They make sure that they're safe from anyone attacking them. And for those next, for the time that they're in that school, they are protected constantly by armed guards. So Little Rock, Arkansas says, fine, if African Americans get to go to school, then nobody gets to school, okay? And they close all the schools in Little Rock for 1958. Now, years before, when I have taught this lecture before, I've said, imagine what it would be like if schools were closed. And look where we are now. So, I mean, what we're doing right now is more probably than what the kids in Little Rock, Arkansas got. But for all of 1958, the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas were closed. Not because of some virus, but because they didn't want the schools to be integrated. But by 1959, the schools were forced to reopen and they were integrated, and Little Rock, Arkansas was integrated. But that was one school. One school getting integrated took all this mess to have it happen. So imagine this being replicated all across the South over and over and over again. This is a big problem. How will schools become integrated if the South is going to fight tooth and nail over every school? Here are, this is the Little Rock Nine, one of the Little Rock Nine trying to come into school on that first day where they're turned away by the crowds. This is Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus speaking to a crowd saying, we're not going to let them get segregated. Here's Dwight D. Eisenhower, who then sends in the 101st Airborne. They're escorting the kids back and forth to school. So the protesters become more and more creative in finding ways to get at segregated laws. By 1960, the entire South is swarmed by the civil rights movement, and the nonviolent measures are helping win supporters. Every time an African American gets punched in the face but doesn't hit back, and it gets put on TV or gets put in the newspapers, people read about it and they say, I think those African Americans, they've got the right idea. And I think those Southerners in Arkansas, they're crazy, okay? And all across the United States, you start to see more and more people supporting the civil rights movement and gaining more and more allies, and the movement grows stronger. On February 1st, 1964, African-American college students sit at a white-only counter in a Woolworths store in Greensboro, North Carolina, kind of like a diner, and they refuse to leave until they're served. They get yelled at, they get stuff poured on them, they get attacked, but they refuse to leave until they're served, and this becomes called a sit-in, where you go to a place where you're not supposed to be, and you stay there. And these sit-ins happen all across the South as individual businesses are pressured to desegregate. Protesters get threatened, often violently attacked, but they didn't fight back. And the world could see who had the moral high ground. Slowly but surely, restaurants and businesses began to change. Martin Luther King Jr. is in the middle of all of this, organizing sit-ins, organizing protest marches, etc., through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress on Racial Equality, okay? There are protests against segregated interstate transportation, segregated swimming pools, segregated churches, etc., etc., and a lot of them are successful. Here's some pictures from, see, the Woolworths counter. We've got people doing sit-ins being, made fun of, attacked, and then even attacked by, the government and the police. Here's some freedom rides. This is a swim-in, a segregated swimming pool, and this guy is throwing acid in there to get him out. This is Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who is a big supporter of the civil rights movement, but he was assassinated in 1968, like we talked about before he had a chance to really do something to help out African Americans as president. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. is at the center of all this, and he leads the civil rights movement to one of its biggest and highest watermarks, which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. believe that's the right title, where he goes to Washington, D.C., and he makes his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a great orator. He was a really good speaker, and he was very good at inspiring people and trying to show people that we needed to live in a country where people were not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King Jr.'s goal is to have equality, where everyone is treated the same. He wants African Americans and white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, it doesn't matter. He wants everyone to be treated with the same dignity and respect. And because of that, he gets a lot of allies from people that are not African American. And this adds strength to the movement. And his nonviolent methods made him much more palatable to whites. Okay, we're going to talk about another man, Malcolm X, in a moment, and he is not the same at all. He uses more violence, and he's more about African Americans first. So Martin Luther King Jr. is much more popular with the broader population of the United States. And because of this, Martin Luther King Jr. is able to make friends with politicians like Lyndon B Johnson, who work to change the laws about civil rights. Okay? As African Americans gain success, resistance grows. Martin Luther King Jr. makes his famous march to Washington in August 1963. He makes his I Have a Dream speech. But at the same time, membership in the Ku Klux Klan increases, hate crimes increase, and attacks on African Americans increase. In Birmingham, Alabama, the police used dogs, tear gas, and fire hoses on protesters. Church burnings and church bombings increase on African American churches. And John F. Kennedy, who was a friend of the civil rights movement, gets assassinated in November 1963. But this turns out to work out well for the civil rights movement because the next president, Lyndon B Johnson, like we talked about in the last video, was very good at working the legislature. Lyndon B Johnson uses his ability to work the press, to work the Senate, to work the House of Representatives, to get enough votes together to sign something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was part of the Great Society, but this law is the most important law for getting rid of segregation. It puts the teeth to the civil rights movement, okay? Remember, Brown versus Board of Education said, desegregate with all deliberate speed, so whenever you feel like it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 put deadlines in, and it put consequences in for people who did not desegregate. There were no consequences if you broke Brown versus Board of Education. But if a school refuses to desegregate, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 takes away their funding. And so all that money that the government gives to help schools operate takes that away. So schools all across the country had to integrate. In fact, that happens to Como-Pickton. You can actually look at the school board records of Pickton in 1964, 1965, and they talk about complying with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and integrating the schools, okay? Civil Rights Act of 1964 made de jure segregation illegal at any public facility, any restaurant, any business, anything. You cannot discriminate on someone because of their race. And the Civil Rights Act also has provisions to prevent gender discrimination, to prevent all sorts of different discrimination. It's all part of the Civil Rights Act, and it does a lot more than just African American civil rights, but that's what we're focusing on right now. After 1964, African Americans pushed to get their voting rights protected, to get rid of things like poll taxes and literacy tests. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution bans poll taxes in 1964, so it is unconstitutional to charge someone a tax in order to get them to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1964 banned any literacy tests or other legal barriers that would keep African Americans from voting. And this was kind of a response to some of the protest marches in Selma in 1965, where African American protesters were just viciously brutalized by the police in the South. And this made a lot of people say, you know what, African Americans, they just want the right to vote. They should not be attacked by dogs and tear gas and beat up by cops just because they want to be able to vote. And so the laws changed to help them get those rights protected. Here are the Selma marches, where you have African American protesters on a peaceful march just get the snot beaten out of them by the police. And this was put on national television. People saw this and they started to want a change to happen. And in 1964 and 1965, the greatest victories for the civil rights movement happened. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans discrimination in public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protects African American rights to vote. But after 1965, things start to slow down. So 1964 and 1965 is the big peak, the victory moment. But after that, it starts to go south. On August 11, 1965, a crowd of African Americans in the Watts district of Los Angeles, California, turned violent in the face of the excessive force on the part of police, okay? The police had arrested a young African American whose name was Marquette Fry, and they were brutal to him. And this led to 5 days of rioting, looting, and burning buildings and protests that turned into it was a protest that just turned into violence. And the peaceful protests that had been going on under Martin Luther King Jr. in the South, when they spread to places like California and the northern United States, they were much more violent. By the end of the Watts riots, we have 34 deaths and $40 million of damages. And from 1964 to 1966, there are outbreaks of violence all across the northern United States and western United States, especially in urban areas. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. The southern United States, the African Americans in the southern United States tended to be much more heavily churchgoers. They tended to be much more united under Martin Luther King Jr., and they were much more receptive to the idea of peaceful protest. And they were fighting against the laws that had to be changed, and they were successful. But in California and in northern United States, like New York and Chicago, there were no laws for segregation, but segregation still happened as a result of de facto segregation. There's still racism. There's still racist cops that are profiling people because they're black, or beating up black people being arrested and beating them up just because they're black. And those things are harder to target and change than a law. A law that says, you know, black people can't ride in the front of the bus, that is a concrete, specific target that you can protest and get rid of. But getting police to stop racially profiling people, that's a lot messier of a problem to solve. And so African Americans in the northern United States and the western United States had a lot more frustration with that, and they had a lot less organization under Martin Luther King Jr. to keep them from being violent. And so a lot of the protests in the rest of the United States are very violent. In 1967, over 150 racial riots occur in American cities. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 leads to 125 more. The Kerner Commission, set forth by the U.S. government, investigates this and finds that white racism is the direct cause of this massive unrest. But instead of trying to solve the problem of racism, white people leave the cities and move to the suburbs in a phenomenon called white flight. This leads to de facto segregation without any rules saying segregation exists. You see, it's illegal to have a school where only white kids get to go. But if all the white people move out of the city and move out into the country where there's only white people living there, they can have a school where it's all white kids without technically breaking the law. This phenomenon of white flight occurred all across the United States. It occurred in Texas. It occurred all over, okay? And white flight created a lot of suburbs that were mostly white, while inner cities tended to be more African American. And so you have segregation happening without any laws making it happen, okay? This leads to all sorts of problems. African Americans are victimized by poor education, unequal employment, urban decay, police brutality. The average income of black households is only slightly more than half of white households. And President Lyndon B Johnson tried to solve a lot of these problems with Great Society reforms, a lot of the Economic Opportunity Act stuff. A lot of those things was designed to help make life for African Americans better on the economic part. But these are much more difficult problems to solve, and the African American Civil Rights Movement doesn't have those big victories after 1965 that they had with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And so in the face of this, we have a different voice for African American civil rights, and his name is Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little And he's a lot more different than Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher. He grew up in the South. He had a father who was a preacher. He had a really good education. He was a doctor. And so, he had a PhD or a doctor of divinity. He wasn't a medical doctor. But Malcolm Little doesn't have that same upbringing. When he was a young kid, he saw Ku Klux Klan terrorists burn his house down. And he had his father allegedly murdered by white people in Lansing, Michigan. Malcolm Little, he ended up moving to Harlem. As a young man, he's desperate. He doesn't have a lot of economic opportunities. He falls into crime. He gets arrested, and he gets sent to jail. When he goes to jail, he goes to the library, and he starts educating himself. And as he's educating himself, he decides to convert to the religion of Islam. You see, Malcolm X studied history, and he realized that African Americans, who had been brought to the United States as slaves, had been forced to do all sorts of things like change their names, and in many cases, a lot of them were forced to become Christians, or rather, they were taken away from their old African religions, and they adopted the religion of their masters, Christianity. And so Malcolm X decides to rebel against that by converting to Islam, which he believes is a more African religion, and he believed that African Americans should be Muslims. And he says that his true last name is unknown, that when his ancestors were brought over as slaves, his true family name was lost, and his name Little was a relic of slavery. And so he changed his last name to X to acknowledge the fact that he didn't really know his own last name. And that is, one of the tragedies for African Americans is their heritage was lost when they were brought over as slaves. And so Malcolm X is saying that this is a problem, and that's a symbol of his protest of separating himself entirely from white culture by rejecting Christianity and changing his own name. He was influenced by Wallace Fard, who is the founder of the Nation of Islam in 1930, which is a group of African American Muslims. Fard rejected Christianity as a white man's religion forced on slaves, and he encouraged all black people to convert to Islam. And the Nation of Islam mixed the religion of Islam with the ideas of black pride and black nationalism. And the Nation of Islam was especially popular in prisons across the United States. Malcolm X had much different goals than Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted equality. He wanted integration. He wanted black and white people to live together in equality. Malcolm X is a black nationalist. What he cared about was not about equality, but advancing the cause of African Americans. His goal was not integration, but rather for black people to have their own schools, their own churches, their own support networks, all free from white oppression. His message was very clear. Whites were not to be trusted, and African Americans needed to be proud of their heritage and set up strong, independent communities. He wanted African Americans to rely on themselves and solve their own problems. And while violence was not ideal, he believed it was justified in self-defense. He didn't believe in turning the other cheek. He believed in defending himself. And so he said black people needed to achieve their rights by any means necessary. One of his most famous speeches is the ballot or the bullet. We're either going to change things with the ballot by voting, or we're going to change it with the bullet. And so he was pretty radical compared to Martin Luther King Jr. And as a result, he was much less popular with the white community. And while Martin Luther King Jr. was able to make friends with politicians and gain these big alliances, Malcolm X was very focused in the black nationalist community. He was an eloquent speaker and he was very controversial, but he ends up splitting up with the group, the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam is only one kind of denomination of Islam, and Malcolm X wants to become more of a traditional Muslim, and he makes a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, which is something that Muslims are supposed to do as part of their religion. After he goes to Mecca, he starts to see other Muslims. He starts to be exposed to ideas beyond just black nationalism. And he actually starts to soften on his stance on violence. He starts to walk back some of his more extreme claims. And he even meets up with Martin Luther King Jr. to discuss ideas. But we never get to know what will happen to the end of Malcolm X's story, because when he split with the Nation of Islam, he made a lot of enemies. and rival black Muslims shoot him at a rally in Harlem, New York on February 21st, 1965, and he dies. But his ideas end up inspiring a movement called the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement gets its start in 1966 after a civil rights leader named James Meredith was shot. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., have a protest march in Mississippi after he's shot. But they end up, after the march, they kind of talk and they discuss things, and they observe that de facto segregation remains strong, even though the laws have changed. They basically get together and say, you know, we did this march, we did this protest, and some things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same. And so one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, his name is Stokely Carmichael, at a rally, he ends up saying, what we need is black power. And that phrase, black power, becomes a chant in the crowd. And then it becomes a slogan. And then it becomes a full-blown movement. The idea of black power is inspired by Malcolm X. And it argues that black people needed to feel a sense of racial pride and self-respect in themselves before any meaningful progress could be achieved. Rather than asking white politicians to take the laws away, Black Power wants black people that have their own power and their own strength and their own organizations that can then take care of themselves and have progress that way. Black Power starts to grow throughout the civil rights movement, and it kind of splinters the movement. Some chapters of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress on Racial Equality actually begin rejecting white membership in their organizations. They don't let white people join their organizations. And some of the chapters even abandon peaceful protest, which is strange from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee abandoning peaceful protest. Martin Luther King Jr. and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they denounce Black Power. They don't like it. They don't like it abandoning nonviolence. They don't like it promoting racially exclusive ideologies. Martin Luther King Jr. wants equality. He wants white and black people to live and work together. Black Power is kind of a separatist movement where black people have their own society, separate from white society. And so Martin Luther King Jr. kind of loses control over the civil rights movement. Up until that point, he's pretty much in charge. But after Malcolm X and after the Black Power movement really takes root, it starts to split. And when the civil rights movement splits between the Martin Luther King wing and the Black Power wing, it's not as effective anymore. Black Power becomes a powerful message. It's simple but effective. And it's especially popular with urban African Americans. African Americans begin celebrating their culture boldly and proudly. You start to see a return of traditional African clothing and colors in their clothing. You start to see more African Americans adopt natural hairstyles rather than, have a lot of product that changes the way their hair looks. They wear their hair naturally. And in fact, there's a movement called Black is Beautiful, where this idea that's saying, don't hide who you are. You're black. That's the way God made you. Be proud of that and display that proudly. Okay. And so the Black is Beautiful sort of slogan leads to a return of a lot of natural hairstyles and a lot of more traditional African style. Okay. The Black Power movement, though, leads to more and more radical movements, specifically the Black Panther Party. Formed in Oakland, California, the Black Panthers openly brandished weapons. They would patrol their own neighborhoods, strutting around with AK-47s, resisting police brutality, actively fighting for black civil rights in their way. Martin Luther King Jr. ends up getting assassinated by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray in 1968, and that leads to a big blow in the civil rights movement. There's a lot of riots that happen as a result, and the Black Panthers see the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. as proof that Black Power is needed. They say the most peaceful African American can't even survive because of white brutality. So black people need to arm themselves. They need to defend themselves, okay? They get this, they have a similar philosophy as Mao Zedong of China, who says political power comes through the barrel of a gun. And so this idea of African Americans violently resisting the police and violently fighting for civil rights, instead of Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent protest, That's what really upset people like Richard Nixon, who, when he ran for president, he said he was going to be a law and order president, which is code word essentially for stopping protesters. Richard Nixon wanted to stop protesters of the Vietnam War. He wanted to stop civil rights protesters, and he covered it up under the guise of law and order. And after 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, after the Black Power movement splits up the civil rights movement, you start to see the civil rights movement itself start to lose ground. After 1965, there aren't a lot of big laws that change the whole country, like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But you do see changes in society. African Americans more boldly accept who they are, and they're proud of their community, and they more boldly assert themselves in politics. And the civil rights movement affects us to this day. It is the reason why we have schools that are integrated. It's the reason why we have a much more prosperous society. As a result of the civil rights movement, the United States is a better place, okay? People are treated with more dignity, they're treated with more respect, and we have the blessings of diversity within our system. But the civil rights movement does not achieve everything that it wanted, okay? There's still racism today. There's still police brutality against African Americans today. There's still a lot of problems that still need to be solved. But the African American civil rights movement's greatest successes happened back in the mid-60s. So with that in mind, we're going to close out. Let me know what you think about the African American civil rights movement. Let me know what you think between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Who had a better philosophy? Who was more successful as a civil rights leader? And until next time, I'll see you later. Keep doing your homework. Keep working on your papers. And if you have any questions, please feel free to call me or send me an email, and I'll be happy to help you. Thank you, and goodbye.